All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Prashant. I am the co-founder and the co-chair of Vegan Greens. As we all know, West Asia is experiencing an unprecedented and an illegal war of aggression by two superpowers. We've seen in real time the genocide in Gaza, the violence increase in the West Bank, the illegitimate war on Lebanon, and now a war of aggression imposed on Iran by the rogue regimes of US and Israel. The consequences of this illegal aggression are wide-ranging, spanning economic, social, and environmental impacts. Vegan Greens, Muslim Greens, and Greens for Animal Protection wanted to use this opportunity to discuss Iran as a nation, its history, and the devastating effects of this war on its people, animals, and the environment. We're extremely lucky to have Dr. Leila Dagan with us to discuss these topics and more. So Dr. Leila is a doctor turned nutritionist, educator, and activist. Her journey to veganism began as an animal rescuer. And after overcoming chronic migraines through a whole food plant-based diet, she was inspired to pursue a master's in clinical and public health nutrition at University College London. She's the founder of Plant-Based Health Justice, a nonprofit that highlights the interconnectedness of oppression and advocates for a healthier, more just and sustainable world. Through her educational platform, which is called Plant Ed Academy, she develops courses and resources that promote culturally sensitive plant-based nutrition while challenging Eurocentric dietary norms and supporting communities to decolonize nutrition and reclaim their health. So before we get started, folks, a couple of housekeeping items. We will have questions at the end, so there's going to be time for that. Don't worry about it. We also ask you to direct your questions in the chat to Megan Tinsley, who is the other co-chair of Vegan Greens. She will take those questions up and organize them for Dr. Leila so she can answer those questions towards the end of the presentation. And I believe that we have disabled chat, but in case if it is enabled for some reason, we request you to keep the comments down and keep it only for questions. So without further ado, here's Dr. Leila. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to talk about Iran at a time when a small but very large group of Iranians are celebrating Iran being bombed. So I'm going to actually start sharing my slides. I feel a bit better once I have the slides in front of me, I guess. So let me start sharing. Okay. All right, so there's a lot to say about Iran, the history and how we got here. But before doing so, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and who I am. I am a vegan, Muslim, non-binary Iranian woman. And if I wanted to add my ethnicity, it would be Azeri. So you see, I'm not Persian. And so what is happening in Iran right now connects to all my identities, which will also inform my talk today. I was born in Iran into a Muslim family, but if there are any Muslims among you, you know that just because you're born in a Muslim family doesn't really mean much. It's also about how they practice Islam. So mine is more like a traditionally religious family. And unlike what you keep hearing from some Iranians, Iran is a Muslim majority country, and Islam is closely tied to our Iranian culture. Just the way, Zoroastrianism, which is another monotheistic religion, it has shaped our culture and tradition. So you see practices from both religions reflected in Iran. So as you can see here, that's Iran, and it is the majority in Iran do identify as Muslims. And you can see the different ethnicities here in Iran. So Iran is not a homogeneous nation. It's made up of many different ethnic groups. As I said, I'm Azeri, there are Persians, so the majority are actually Persians, Kurds, Lurs, Arabs, Baluch, and many other ethnicities. Whenever I talk about the different ethnicities, there is always one Iranian who says, you forgot my ethnicity, because there are just so many, you cannot cover all of them. And another thing that makes Iran kind of unique in some aspects is that Iran was never formally, kind of officially colonized. Although there have always been foreign imperial powers which have influenced Iran. Now, growing up in the West, I grew up in Austria and I live in the UK now. What I have seen is that it is how Iran is being spoken about. And I know that can be actually said about a lot of countries and populations in the global South. So a lot of what is happening in Iran and beyond is a struggle over narrative. And I find it is always worth asking, who are the people talking about Iran? And a lot of the news that we are getting from Iran, somebody is sponsoring those news. So who are those sponsors and what is the agenda? So I hope that my talk today can actually introduce some context and challenge some of that narrative, some of the narratives that you have been hearing in the news. Now, to understand Iran, we need to look at its modern history, which begins in the early 20th century. And when you do that, you see that Iran has tried many times to build a democracy. So this is a map of Iran. I wanted to show that to you because I thought it would be nice to see how large the country is. It's a huge country. And so it is over the US and, on the right, it is over Europe. So it is, the proportion. So now, so when you look at the early 20th century, that is when the modern history of Iran started, you see that Iran was caught between two imperial powers. We had the British Empire and the Russian Empire. Russia obviously dominated the north and Britain was in the south. Now, Britain was really focused on protecting its path to India. That is what Britain was interested in. But the influence that they had wasn't just military. They both had deep financial control over Iran through loans, trade, and concessions. And of course, when they have so much power, this led to more and more frustration and anger in Iran. And eventually, that anger led to a constitutional revolution. So the Shah at the time was forced to accept a constitution and establish a parliament, but that was only, on paper. And as soon as that happened, the foreign powers that I mentioned, they started undermining this new political order. And at first, Britain was, supporting the constitutionalists, but then they changed their position. So Britain and Russia, they started cooperating with each other. And these two empires, they actually signed an agreement between themselves, dividing Iran into zones of influence. And so, the north with Tehran and some other big cities fell under Russian control. The southeast was under British influence. And then there was this neutral zone in between. And no Iranian was consulted as they were doing that. Now, this, again, wasn't just on paper. This had actually real impact on people's lives. Russia was supporting the Shah at the time, and eventually Russia sent troops against the constitutionalists. And I like to mention something here from that time, which is the siege of Tabriz. And there are three reasons why I find that this is an important thing to mention. First, it's personal to me. The leader of the, during that siege was Sattar Khan, who is quite a famous, revolutionary person in Iran. And he happens to be, or he used to be, he was the uncle of my great-grandmother. So that's why it is, I have a personal, connection to that. Second, it shows that starvation, which we have been seeing, in the last more than 2 years, it has always been used as a weapon of empire. Because when Tabriz was sealed off, no food could come in and thousands of people died. And they didn't die from, fighting. They died, as a consequence of disease and lack of food. Now, the third reason is there is a phrase which comes from that period of time, which is translate, it would be خاک میخورم اما خاک نمیدم, which means translated, we eat soil, but we will not give up our land. And this is important because even now, in January, and this is, we are talking about a century later, you still hear that phrase. In January, when Trump started threatening Iran, and people knew that a war was imminent. I read a lot of posts on social media, and Azeris were saying, we will eat earth, but we will not give up our land. And even now, during the current war, you hear variations of that phrase. I hear people saying in videos, I give my life, but I will not give up my land. Or I even heard a mother saying, I give my sons, but I will not give up our land. So I think this moment in Iran's history is still very much alive in the country's collective memory, and which is kind of beautiful, really. Now, the next major event was when oil was discovered in Iran, and that changed everything. Because when, up until then, Iran was important because of its location. But after that, Iran was important because of oil. And oil, or rather control over oil, became the main focus for the imperial powers, especially for Britain. And, obviously, the country was under the influence of these imperial powers, and eventually things reached a breaking point and the parliament was shut down. So Iran's chance at democracy was cut short. And Iran still had a constitution on paper, but in reality, there was no real power. So Reza Khan, who is the grandfather of the Reza Pahlavi that you see in the news, in 1921, he staged a coup with the backing of the British people. So, they said, we would actually support you if you do that. That's, I have learned that that's how coups usually happen. They kind of indicate that if you do something, we're not going to actually interfere, So that's what happened. And then a few years later, he founded the Pahlavi dynasty. And that is what you keep hearing in the news. Now, he crowned himself Reza Shah. And I think it is important to note that this was a new dynasty. So it was, it's not like a continuation of some ancient royal family as it is often presented in the news. They like to frame themselves as if they are kind of part of the ancient Persian Empire. No, it was he himself crowned himself Shah. And he, pushed for rapid modernization, roads, railways, schools, a new legal system. The University of Tehran was created at the time. And then he would actually send students abroad to study. The students were expected to come back, obviously, to Iran and bring that new knowledge, but also bring back Western ideas. Because he was Reza Khan was very much interested in modernization. So during this time, what he did, he didn't ban it, but he discouraged traditional clothing. And remember, Iran has so many different ethnicities, so many different traditional clothes. But then what he did is, in 1936, he actually banned the veil. So he tried to push religion out of public life. And I think that is where the idea of modernity, which equates progress to westernization, comes from. So, and that idea comes usually at the expense of, Islamic identity. And that is something we still see and hear. You may have heard Iranians like to say, I am modern. What they mean is that they are westernized, they are not religious. I even saw a footage actually from Tehran after a neighborhood had been bombed. And an Iranian man was saying, look at me, I'm modern, I have tattoos, so why are they bombing us? So I think you could argue that the idea of modernity versus Islam was shaped during this period. And this had kind of a huge impact on people's life. Obviously, there are people who are deeply religious, but it has created that friction, which you still, see on social media. Now, at the same time, globally, there was the Second World War. in Europe. And Reza Shah actually declared neutrality, but he had close ties with Germany and he refused to expel German nationals. So in 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union, they weren't happy about it. They didn't think that they can actually trust Reza Shah, so they invaded Iran. And this was a very short invasion, lasted just a few weeks. A lot of people died, but they forced Reza Shah actually to step down. So again, you see, there was foreign intervention and they decided the fate of Iran. He was replaced by his son, who is Mohammad Reza Shah, and he's the father of Reza Pahlavi. And he's also the one who fled Iran during the 1979 revolution. Now, the next attempt at sovereignty was when Iran tried to take back control of the oil. Because up until then, the oil industry was actually controlled by a British company called the Anglo Iranian Oil Company. But then there was a democratic election and Mohammad Mossadegh was elected as prime minister. And he really pushed to nationalize the oil. He wanted Iran to take back control of its own resources. Now, as you can imagine, Britain, and at the time it was more the US, which was, coming into power, they were not happy about this. So in 1953, the UK and the US, they staged a coup. Mossadegh was removed, the Shah was restored, and after that, the Shah actually became more and more authoritarian. And also from that point on, it was more the US which was the main foreign power in Iran. So you could say actually the US kind of replaced Britain. Now, the Shah, carried on with the modernization. He also built a strong security state. And SAVAK, which you may have seen again, the logo or, mention of it on social media, it was Shah's secret police. And it was actually trained, by CIA and Mossad, and they carried out surveillance, arrests, and torture. So opposition was crushed. And socially, there was a lot of pressure to become more westernized. So he didn't actually ban the hijab like his father had, but kind of the hijab was discouraged, in public life. Now, having said that, it is important to mention that the Shah himself, he was actually a Muslim. He spoke a lot about it in his interviews. And the reason I mentioned that is because, again, you hear a lot of the pro-Pahlavi Iranians saying they're not Muslims, but actually the Shah himself used to call himself, Muslim. He went on Hajj, which is like the Islamic pilgrimage. And he even chose, Islamic names for his children, So I think it was more about the role that Islam played in public life at the time. So he was just trying to push it more out of the public life. Now, the Shah also pushed one national identity. So by doing that, there was little space for all these different ethnic groups and languages. Again, remember, I showed you that there are so many different ethnic groups in Iran, and all of them, of course, they are, proud of their language, their traditions, their clothes. So, but, Shah was actually trying to kind of get rid of it, really. So when you look at everything so far, you start to see a pattern. Every time there is a move toward democracy or self-determination, foreign powers step in and shut it down. And another thing is that every time there is modernization, it comes at the expense of religion and local identities. And I think that is important to understand, and that also explains what happened next, because all of these tensions reached a breaking point. And that led to, mass unrest and eventually the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Now, the Iranian Revolution, it wasn't just led by one group. It really involved a mix of people. Yes, the cleric played a huge role, but there were also leftists, students, intellectuals, and merchants, the bazaris. They were all involved. Now, I'm sure they didn't all have the same vision for Iran's future, but what they had in common was, opposition to dictatorship and to foreign control. And after the revolution, Iran was declared as an Islamic Republic. Now, a republic meant basically an end to monarchy, and it also suggested that there would be elections and a parliament. Islamic meant that the system would be grounded in Islamic principles. Now, one of the main ideas that shaped the Iranian Revolution and later the state is the idea of standing with the oppressed against the oppressor. And this comes from the Shia Islam. And, I'm not going to go into it, but it has, historically, it comes from, Karbala, which is, again, a very important event in Shia Islam. And that also explains why a lot of Shia Muslims around the world look up to Iran. And when Khamenei was assassinated recently, a lot of them were actually kind of mourning and upset. So they felt kind of really affected by that. So going back to Iran, Iranian foreign policy is shaped by an anti-imperial ideology. And I think that is what we still see, playing out today. But going back to 1979, there was another major event, and that was the hostage crisis. So Iranian students actually stormed the US embassy in Tehran and they took control of it. This was because of the US involvement in Iranian politics, so they weren't happy about it. And it was also because the US was supporting the Shah at the time. So that is when the US started freezing Iranian assets and banned trade. In a way, you could say that, sanctions began in that time. Yes, over the last few decades, they changed. Sometimes they were stricter, they were, or they got a bit better. But that is when the sanctions really started. And I think that's also very important when we look at Iran's economy. Now, there were a few other major events, after the revolution. One of them is the 1980 when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. And that war lasted 8 years. And again, Western powers, the US, they supported Iraq. So I think what you see, by the way, that picture shouldn't have come here. There is something wrong with my animation. Sorry about that. So what you see is that since 1979, Western powers have tried to undermine the Iranian government. And, when you read articles from that time, you read how US politicians, they openly admit that they had lost a key ally, after the revolution. And that was a major geopolitical setback during the Cold War. So, there has always been pressure from outside. So, Iran was, or the Islamic Republic was under pressure from outside, the sanctions and all of that. They were trying to undermine them. And I guess you could say that they wanted to get rid of them, since the revolution. But at the same time, inside the country, the Islamic Republic actually held onto power by tightly controlling political opposition. So anybody who openly challenges the government is often imprisoned. And we have had a lot of protests happening in Iran, and most of them happened after the Iran-Iraq war. I'm just going to mention two of them. So one of them was in 2009, the Green Movement. And that was because there was an election and people suspected fraud. And so, they took to the streets and the opposition leaders at the time, they were arrested. And as far as I know, they are still under house arrest. Then there was, there were a few other protests, which I'm not going to mention here, but more recently, the Women Life Freedom movement after Mahsa Amini was killed. Now, many of these protests, they actually they were met with violence. So, killings, imprisonment, and torture. So what we see is a society that has been resisting internal oppression. They pay the price, but at the same time, they do create change. For example, the dress code, which is something that a lot of people keep talking about, they want to liberate the Iranian women. So after the Women Life Freedom, for example, things began to shift. And before the war, I would get pictures and videos from Iran, from the family members, and also on social media, I could see a lot of videos, and you could see that women were not wearing the mandatory hijab anymore. You see women running in parks, playing sports, and they were wearing what you could consider, Western clothing. Now, I want to be very careful here because when you talk about Iran and the repression in Iran, it is not easy to do so because it is very easy to reproduce the Western narratives. Many of us, including those in Iran and other global South countries, we get our news through Western media. In Iran, there are two diaspora channels. One is the Iran International, which is sponsored by UAE. And another one is the Manoto TV channel, which is sponsored by a pro-Israeli Iranian group. So, of course, they have their own political agendas. And both of them, especially Iran International, played a huge role in manufacturing consent for the current war. That was the news channel which started spreading the rumor about the high death tolls during the protests in January. So they played a huge role. And that is where most Iranians inside Iran, not, when I say most, I should be careful here. I don't have a percentage, but many people, the elite and many people who have access or, they get their news from those channels. So I think this also raises a question of what information we can actually trust. And I know Iran is not unique in this. I mean, we have seen since October 7 how the Western media always distorts the news and has biases. Now, when it comes to Iran, again, many Iranians, I don't have a percentage, but that is from my lived experience, but also from people I know, people I have spoken to. They don't trust anything that the government says. And they always criticize everything the Iranian government does. For example, I'll give you an example. Now, since this war started, I have heard people complain about the lack of bunkers. But, I mean, does the UK have any bunkers? Yes, they do, but not for the general public. And another example that many of you may be familiar with is the bombing of the school in Minab. I mean, the US has already taken responsibility, kind of, but Iranians, especially those who are pro-Pahlavi, they still insist it was the regime. And here I want to talk about language, regime, that these words are often used by the West when they want to, intervene in the politics of another country and install their puppet. So we really need to be always careful how the West has distorted the narratives. And that brings me to the current war. And this current conflict, if you want to call it, didn't start, 3 weeks ago. It didn't even start last June. Netanyahu actually said this war allows us to do what I have been hoping or what I have been wishing to do for 40 years. And there is a lot of, articles, and we know that for over 30 years, he has been warning the world that Iran is on the verge of having nuclear weapons. For over 30 years, he keeps saying it is going to happen soon. We need to take action. So this war on Iran, this unprovoked war on Iran, is a blatant imperial war to weaken a country that refuses to align with Western interests. And again, that is something we have seen in Iraq, Syria, Venezuela, and many other countries. So just as Netanyahu has wanted this war for 40 years, the Iranian government has resisted external domination for 47 years. And, I mentioned the siege of Tabriz earlier, where starvation was used as a weapon. But there is another form of warfare that the Western governments employ: sanctions. Sanctions function as structural violence. Now, I don't know if you knew that food and medicine are actually supposed to be exempt, but in reality, when there are restrictions, it is very hard to bring in essential medicines. So there will be medicine shortage. And what that means is that people with cancer, with chronic illnesses, they are going to suffer. And as a result, the death toll, the mortality and morbidity will increase. And of course, when there are sanctions, they also cause inflation and currency collapse. That is something that we saw end of December. And that means that people cannot afford food or healthcare. In fact, in Iran, nobody talks about it, but around 1/3 of the population lives in poverty. And many cannot meet their basic nutritional needs. And of course, on top of this, there is climate change. And we know that the countries in the global south are usually hit the hardest, even though those countries contribute less to the problem of the climate change just because, of the consumption. Anyway, going back to sanctions, sanctions actually limit access to new clean technologies, investment, or environmental corporations. That means that Iran relies on older systems, and that makes Iran become more vulnerable to drought, water shortages, and environmental damage. Now, I just want to mention that, yes, I'm aware there will be corruption and other internal conflicts and issues with that. But we also need to address the sanctions, which have played a huge role. And now we have war. I'm sure you have seen the oil depots which were bombed. So there were fires which burned for hours in Tehran and other areas. So they're going to release, toxic compounds into the air. And this will harm human health, of course, but also damage ecosystems. Animals are going to be affected. Iran has a large population of stray dogs and cats. And we know bombs don't discriminate. And all of that will also affect animals who are used in the food system, in factory farms. So when there is rising temperatures, environmental damage, that is going to lead to more disease, suffering, and even mass deaths of these animals. Now, as a vegan, I have noticed that Iran is mostly absent from the conversations within vegan and animal rights spaces. And it is not because these groups are apolitical and don't speak up against war. No, we saw how vocal many were when Ukraine was attacked. A lot of these organizations, these mainstream vegan organizations, they organized fundraisers for animals and Ukrainians, including Ukrainian soldiers. But they don't offer the same care and attention to countries in the global south or to Muslim majorities countries. And, this picture is from a cat in Gaza. Now, I often hear people talk about selective compassion or selective solidarity. I actually prefer to call it inconsistency in their ethical values, because I think, it points to a contradiction in what these people claim to stand for. When we say selective compassion or selective solidarity, it still makes them, look good, sound good and ethical. Whereas inconsistency, it has a more negative connotation. And I hope that by using that, it makes people feel kind of uncomfortable and maybe, they start reflecting. So this takes me to one question. What is anti-oppression? What does oppression mean? Now, according to Cambridge Dictionary, oppression is a situation in which people are governed in an unfair and cruel way and prevented from having opportunities and freedom. I know this is a simple definition, but I think it's enough for the purpose of this talk. So, how do we actually measure oppression? I mean, is oppression number of people killed? Is it internal repression, external domination? Is it when people are suffering because of economic, challenges? Is it when people don't have any free access to basic needs like food and healthcare? I think, I don't have the answers. I'm just inviting you to think critically and ask yourself, what is oppression and how do we know that oppression is happening? There are groups that define oppression in a very narrow way. For example, a lot of vegans do that. A lot of mainstream vegan groups, they focus only on harm to animals. They don't care about war, sanctions, or structural systemic violence. But then if we follow that logic, then every country becomes oppressive because, there is factory farming, right? So back to my question, how do we measure oppression? Another narrative that I have seen a lot on social media is that, even Western countries like the US, UK, or France, they cracked down brutally on protesters. So why do we, talk about Iran and how Iran is handling, the protests? Or now we are in the UK, there are some phrases that we cannot use in the UK, some words, and if we do, we risk jail. So, so what is the difference between UK and Iran? But I don't agree with this line of argument. I don't find it helpful. Just the fact that other states are also oppressive doesn't excuse or justify oppression elsewhere. The same way that a lot of vegans there who call themselves anti-intersectional, they say like, they are vegans, they're not harming any animals, and that's it, end of it. But then they are racists. It feels almost like, I'm not harming animals, but it's okay if I harm, human beings. We cannot, oppression doesn't really work like that. So here is another question. What does it mean to be anti-oppressive? So I believe being anti-oppressive is about holding complexity without losing sight of power and injustice. But it also means being consistent, being consistent in what we oppose. And it's also about recognizing that all these struggles are interconnected and the root causes are the same. We need to recognize the root causes. We cannot ignore the root causes. We cannot, forget that these struggles are interconnected. Because when we do that, then we start prioritizing some causes over others. And then we end up reproducing the same oppressive systems, the same hierarchies, because it is a hierarchical system that is creating oppression, that, certain groups are better than the others, or certain people, or, whatever. Certain ethnicities are better than the others. Okay, I'm aware that a lot is happening around the world, and it is easy to feel overwhelmed and not to know where to start. So I want to finish with giving you some steps that you can actually take. So I believe the first step is to recognize our own power. We are not powerless. When we start believing that we don't have any power, then we feel, apathetic. We are not going to take any action. And, I see that quite a lot. A lot of people keep asking me, do you really think someone like Trump is going to listen to you? We have more power than we realize. And that is where actions like BDS come in. Over the last 2 years, we have seen success stories. We have seen, Starbucks and other, branches, actually close down. So it does work. So we need to continue with that. And in fact, we need to ask ourselves, what else can I do, in terms of BDS? Then we also need to educate ourselves. Now, I'm not saying that we need to learn about the history of every country and every struggle, but we need to understand or know enough to understand and to get the bigger picture of what is happening. I have been speaking about Palestine since I was a teenager, so I have always been familiar with the history. But when I first started hearing about Congo and Sudan, I realized how little I knew about these countries. Then I remember that I attended a talk on Congo, and that is when I learned about, Belgium, how Belgium got its wealth, from Congo. And I learned about the chocolate industry, how, cacao was taken from Congo. And then after that, the Belgian chocolate, it had a different meaning to me. That's why we need to understand certain things to get how, all these exploitations work and how we are still actually, seeing them. The same way with Dubai chocolate, we keep hearing, but then that is okay. We can learn more. That's fine. Now, my final point is we need to question everything. So much of what we accept as normal, is shaped by systems of power. And, we take so many things for granted. Sometimes, something as like ordinary as the food we eat or the products we buy. For example, again, I guess many of you are vegans. The idea that animal protein is necessary for survival, so many people take that for granted. It's like kind of almost like as it is the ultimate truth. Or the need to upgrade our phones or fashion, fast fashion. All of these industries, they have histories of exploitation. And we may not immediately see that. So we need to always question and learn how, the things that we take for granted. And that also includes the language we use. I already talked about regime, how this is actually more like a colonial word, but also terms like terrorism or even peace. Many of these have been tools of oppression, they have been weaponized. So I really think that we need to be more critical of what we have been told, of what we are being told, or if we don't, we are going to become complicit in what we are seeing around us, in all the oppressions around us. All right, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing and then good.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Leila. That was so rich and so nuanced, and my mind is swimming with questions. I imagine I'm not the only one. Just a reminder, if you do have a question, please just type it in the chat and then select my name under two. And I've been following the chat. There are a few questions there already, but now we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So the first question, well, there are two questions, and I'll take them together because I think they're closely related. So one person is asking, what does it mean to be anti-imperialist, and why I use this term? And then there's a second question that why do certain leftist circles argue that the government in Iran is not really anti-imperialist?
Okay, I should just say I'm not a political analyst, okay? When I talk about Iran, this is more my lived experience, and also, of course, as an Iranian, I'm interested, so I have read quite a lot about it, and I'm also interested in decolonization. So, so that's where my knowledge comes from. So, anti-imperialism is just when you look at how imperial powers, those foreign powers, which are actually Western powers, I should say, how they have tried to expand their territory. And most of it, the way it is done is they want to expand their territory so that they can access it is about expanding their territories, just full stop, but it's also about getting access to resources, and resources can be land, natural resources, minerals, oil, what have you, but also people. People are actually as labor, cheap labor. So that is imperialism, and anti-imperialism is being against all of that. Now, when it comes to Iran, I think at the end of the day, Iran is just a state. Yes, it calls itself Islamic, and the framework that I mentioned, being, with the oppressed against the oppressors, that is their philosophy, and they have really tried to live up to that, and that's why they have always, supported Palestine, for example. Now, having said that, I have heard that sometimes, I guess it's just, with states, whenever I hear that a politician is vegan, for example, I just think, what compromises did he make to actually become a politician, to become, to get to that position? Because you have to make compromises. Just the way the systems are working, it's just a system, right? It is, and if you want to survive in that system, you play the game. So has the Iranian government always been anti-imperialist and or not? I don't know. I have heard that there have been some occasions, but again, I don't know enough about the politics to be able to say that. But as I said, I don't like to make that argument, but I guess I believe that no government is actually free of guilt. Let's call it that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. The next question is from Sana Zara, who asks, most of us from the global south have internalized racism because of being colonized, but I've noticed that it's really bad in some communities, for example, with Iranians, the delusion that they're white. I'm wondering why it's so bad. I've rarely seen other diasporas celebrate their own being bombed. I can't find a reason, and I'm wondering if Leila has any thoughts.
Gosh, yes, I could actually give a talk just on that. I think, again, when we look at the history, and although I said it started during Reza Khan and when he was modernizing the country, but even before that, early 20th century, there were Iranians who were going abroad, so, to France and Britain especially, and they were learning from them. They came back and said, oh, no, we need to actually be secular. So there was always this tension between religion and modernity. Yes, the modernity looks like westernization, but they call it modernity. So they wanted to be modern. And part of being modern is saying no to religion. And I also mentioned that, during the Second World War, Russia and Britain actually invaded Iran because Iran refused to expel German nationals. Now, there is a bit of the idea that Iranians are from Aryan race started during that period. It wasn't the Nazi ideology, but it was similar to that. So it was more like we are different. We are different than all the other people in the global south. We are, it's not so much as they are white, but they do see themselves as white. And it is quite interesting because they're actually black Iranians, like really black. I have cousins who are black. And it is interesting because I'm not. I'm quite actually fair. So you see, it is a mixed. But then it's also about when you look at the Iranian society. For example, I have an accent. So when I'm with Iranians, they look down on me because I have my accent. And I have heard people saying, if some of the comments on my videos on social media is about oh, I can't understand your, accent. Are you from village? Which means are you backward? And or they say, oh, you look like a servant. So it is always like this idea that if you're not modern, if you're not wearing these revealing clothes, and I'm a Muslim, so then you are backward. So I think, and the idea is that because it is the Islamic Republic, they hate the Islamic Republic. The hatred is so much. What I heard is actually before the war, a few people were saying Khamenei is Hitler. And I was like, what? Where have you been the last 2.5 years? How can you say Khamenei is Hitler? I'm not saying he's a saint, but, comparing him, equating him with Hitler. So I think it is this deep hatred towards the Islamic Republic because they are actually trying to bring everything that these Iranians, they're trying to avoid or to deny even that it exists. I hope it makes sense. It is, I don't like to say it's complex, but I was saying before the talk that, when it comes to Iranians, it's such a complex, messy society, honestly.
Thank you for that. The next question is from Richard Tadakot, who asks, does it make a difference to the present how informed and supportive or unsupportive the average British citizen was about past British interventions in Iran?
I think knowing your history is important, to be honest. And I think especially white people, I don't like to say white people, but people from the global north, they need to learn about their history and how their countries were complicit in exploiting us, the global south, and how they continue doing that. And, when I see our historical, heritage sites being bombed, and then I go for a walk here in London, and I think, look at them. They are, preserving their own history, but they're bombing ours, and nobody bats an eye. And we saw the same in Gaza, by the way. There's nothing unique about what is happening in Iran. If anything, I'm like how could Palestinians, endure that, So, and I think as white people, you have a lot of responsibility because you are actually enjoying privilege. And even if you say, no, I am from, I don't know, working class or, whatever, no, you have privileges just because of your skin color, because of your history, because of your country, because of your nationality, because of the passport you travel with. So you have a lot of responsibility to educate yourself, see how you and your people have been complicit, and you have to take actions to undo that, to make good. I'm sorry if I come across as a kind of not angry, but I think, it shouldn't be on us. It shouldn't always be on us to educate you, to ask for our rights, because it is tiring. It's really exhausting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. The next question is from Shun Ai, who says, Shukran Gamshia for this talk, Dr. Degan. I'm seeing a lot of parallels between Taiwan and Iran in historical moments and the after effects. I'm also quite curious about your view on potentials of non-Western understandings of purification or purity that could drive and focus a consistent solidarity.
I'm not sure if I understand what you mean with purification, purity.
Shun Ai, would you like to add?
Would you
leave it in the chat? Let's see. I'll ask to unmute. I just invited you to unmute.
Yeah.
Shunai, so feel free to jump in.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Great. Hi. My question is, I'm intrigued by the part where you talked about how like modernity seemed to push directly against like the Muslim identification in the Muslim majorityness. And I think about that a lot because there's a way that in Abrahamic faiths, non-Abrahamic faiths, the state will use the notion of purity. They'll use religious language to justify fascism. So, because religious purity and political purity are actually quite different. But what you said earlier about the lack of consistency of ethics, it does actually come from oftentimes found in philosophy or religion, the understanding of purity, that we want to arrive towards that teleology, but it needs to be done with a lot of compassion and wisdom. And I'm just wondering if you see anything in that, because a critique that a lot of vegans receive is, why are you being such a purist? But the purity comes, it's this focus or this devotion that I think the West is very uncomfortable with. And I think there could be a lot of potential. So I know I'm not asking you this in the most focused way, but it's also like 2:30 right now in Taiwan. So please excuse my lack of clarity, if that makes sense.
I get what you are trying to say. And I'm Muslim, and what I like about Islam is that it is a religion for life. So you don't need to be perfect. So it's always like kind of trying to do your best. Now, having said that, I want to go back to what you used, compassion. I think compassion is so important, especially again as vegans. I think for us, I have worked in some mainstream vegan organizations, and I was always the one who was pushing to be like kind of, we should actually go for 100%, meat free, not just 50%. And I think we need to have that high standard. Right? That should be our standard. Yes, that is our aim, and that we need to use that in our language. But when it comes to practice talking to people, you need to choose compassion, always compassion over ideology. Because if there is no compassion, how are we going to change people? I think a bit of kindness goes a long way. And I think that is what is missing in vegan mainstream organizations. There is no compassion. It has turned into like a brand, a lifestyle, just talking about animals all the time. Look, everything I do, even my human rights activism, is because of animals. People don't get it. I'm so interested in Iran because all I want is to go back and help the animals in Iran. But we cannot do that by forcing people. The minute you start forcing someone to change, you're actually, harming. There is an Iranian scholar whom I really like and admire. He's dead. He was killed actually in the UK. He says that the best way to harm a movement is by defending it badly. And I think sometimes when I hear vegans talk, I think, you are just harming the animals, the very animals you keep saying that you are trying to rescue and save and help. So I believe in compassion first, I think, and then people are they're just more open to listen to you when you come from that place. They know that you're not forcing them. You're not, it's almost like saying, look, you're bad, change. Nobody's going to change when you come from that position. When you say, look, it's always also about, distinguishing between the act and the person, performing that act. They are two different things. So yeah, I hope that answered your question, or part of it at least. We can have that conversation on social media.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So the next two questions are similar, so I'm going to ask them together. The first is from Ben, who's just turned on his camera there. Ben says, I agree with all of your points. How do we organize anti-fascism and imperialism? What do you think? And then similarly, C says, thank you so much for your informative talk. What can we do now as activists to support Iranians? Are there specific fundraisers or groups that you'd recommend that we support or look into, etc.?
Well, the first point about how can we get organized, I really believe that we need to educate ourselves. I remember when the genocide in Gaza started, I started a meeting, an online meeting to talk about dehumanization and stuff like that. And there was a vegan from the US, and she said, it's fine, we can learn all about that later, but right now we need to stop the genocide. And now we are, 2.5 years into it, nothing has changed. So I think learning, educating ourselves is so important. There's a saying which says, when in rush, slow down. We need to take the time to learn about all these things, because if we don't, we are just reproducing the same, oppressive system. So I would say, learn about all of that, about the history, and that will already give you ideas, what you can do. So I truly believe in educating ourselves. There are so many great books out there about decolonization, Orientalism, self-Orientalization. I can recommend so many books, and you will need to start asking questions, educating yourself, and then you come up with ideas yourself. Again, we need to cooperate. It's not somebody giving you the answers. We all are part of it. I believe in power with, not power over. So that's the first. And the second one, sadly, because of sanctions, there aren't any organizations that can actually, transfer money. I used to do that via family members, like kind of, I have a few family members in Norway. I would send them the money. They would send it, and then when they would go to Iran, they would give it. So it was like a complicated system. Having said that, just recently I heard about an animal rescue in the US, which is doing a fundraiser. I don't know how they are going to send the money, but it is just for one shelter in Iran. It is actually in Tabriz, but still, it's just, there's so many shelters. So I can, tell you more about that, organization if you want to send money. I usually, as I said, I do it over family members, because even when I was active in animal rescue, Romania and Bosnia, I always send it to shelters which I have verified. I'm 100% sure that the money is going to be used for animals. So I can recommend animal rescues if you want to. Apart from that, to be honest, because of the sanctions, there aren't any, groups which send money. As soon as the war ends, I'm going to go to Iran myself. So I'm going to do a fundraiser when I go. But until then. Now, the other thing you can do, and I don't know where you are, in which country you live, call your representatives, put pressure on them not to escalate this war, to end it. All of us, if you're living in the global north, our tax money is paying for these bombs, not just in Iran. I don't even know. There are so many countries. I don't even know which one to, mention here. So we can actually put some pressure on on your government. It's not my government, sorry. I'm actually Austrian, but anyway, they're fascist. So yes, I think, in the global north, we do have some power through elections and calling your representatives and going to these marches, and really but also listening to what people say. I know there is not one, Iranians are not a monolith, and you see all these different voices. But again, put pressure on your governments. That's all I can say, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for saying that. I did drop a link in the chat that Leila shared about a site that Leila says where donations are possible, the IFRC. So everyone can see that. What is going to have to be the final question, unfortunately, although there are more in the chat, so apologies if I haven't gotten to everyone's. The questions remaining are very nuanced, so I invite everyone to please reach out to Dr. Leila on social media with these questions. I think we could go on for hours having this conversation, but I think the final question is helpful to summarize really what you've said. So that question is from SJ, who asks, how can we better link the war in Iran and the genocide in Palestine to the climate and environmental impacts of these military escalations?
Well, I think it is so clear, you know. I mean, I don't, I'm sorry, I'm not kind of sure what to answer because I think, bombs, the toxic compounds that are released, and then the buildings that are, turned into rubble, and so many other, depending on what infrastructure they're actually kind of targeting and attacking, the fires, and then also they have to rebuild it. So I think, the impact is so huge. I was actually saying before the talk, I don't get it. Don't they get it? Forget about humans, forget about animals. Climate change is what is going to kill us, and they're not doing anything. We don't have a lot of time. And what just happened in Iran with the oil depots, and if it continues like that, it is even going to make the time that we have left to do something less. I mean, we are going to reach a point where it is irreversible. We can't do anything about it. So, to be honest, when it comes to climate change, I'm shocked. Again, as I said, forget about humans and animals, because that is the one thing when we don't have any water to drink, when, the climates are so high, the temperatures, and we are going to die, all the illnesses we are going to get. It's a disaster, to be honest. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered actually your question, to be honest, because I just think there is so much to talk about, every single bomb, every single, weapon or anything that they are using in these areas.
Thank you. I think there is so much to say, and yet, as you said, the connections are so clear that we really do need to be working in solidarity across movements, across geopolitical spaces as well, to see that our fate is interconnected. Thank you once again, Dr. Leila, for a fantastic talk.
you.
I'm going to go away with more questions and look forward to having a chance to ask more questions online. Thank you to everyone for attending and contributing. This event has been recorded and it will be posted online on the Vegan Greens YouTube. So if you missed part of it, feel free to catch up that way. And on behalf of Vegan Greens, thank you to our friends at Muslim Greens and Greens for Animal Protection for co-sponsoring this event. And please stay tuned for future webinars. Thank you, everyone, once again. Solidarity, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.